In this video, we're going to walk through part 1 of the repetition statement lab. In the lab, it talks about how last week in lab, we created a program that read in a certain course grade and then printed an advice message for a student who might be receiving that grade. This week, we're going to expand on that program so that rather than just working for a single student, we're going to repeat our code so that it prints advice messages for multiple students. And the lab has a short description about the program we're trying to create. It says, let's suppose we want to write the program for Dr. Annewald's individual study students. If she has exactly 4 students doing projects with her this semester, let's write a program that Dr. Annewald can use to ask for the course average for 4 students and print a message about how their performance is going in the course to the screen. And first thing it does is asks you to write a IPO chart for this particular problem. To get you started, I cut and pasted all of the correct IPO information from the previous week's lab. For each individual student, we're going to have to read in the student's course average. We're going to have to use a conditional statement to determine which course or which message we want to print for the grade. And then finally, we want to print out the selected advice for the student's grade. So that worked great if we just had a single student. In this week's lab, we're trying to repeat these statements so that they'll execute for multiple students. And if you think back to the description, it tells us that we know that Dr. Annewald has exactly 4 individual study students this semester. So we're going to use a count-controlled repetition statement here. I'm going to write it so that it looks kind of like Python code, but if you were doing this on your own, you could write it in English, and that would be just fine too. I know that a count-controlled loop has 3 parts. It has the initialization step, the loop control, and the update step. And for a count-controlled situation, this is what those look like. The initialization step always says count equals 0. The loop test always says, well, counts less than the maximum number of times you want to repeat. So since we want to repeat 4 times, we want to write while counts less than 4. Then we're going to perform all of these statements in the event that the count has the proper value. And then finally, at the end of the loop, we want to update the value of count. We want to make the count equal count plus 1. So those 3 additional lines, those are the lines we would need to represent the fact that these statements are going to repeat for multiple students. And technically, we're also going to have to ask for the student's course average up here. And we'll need to print out the message down here at the bottom. So all of those things are repeated for each student. For each student, we're going to ask for the average, determine what the message is, print out the message, and then update the value of count so that we move on to the next student. So now we're going to write our Python program using our IPO chart as a guide. I'm going to try to get it on the screen here so that I can have it right next to me while I'm typing into idle. So in my program, I know that I'm using a repetition statement. So the first thing I need to do is set my counter equal to 0 because I'm using a count-controlled repetition statement. Then I'm going to write my loop control that repeats 4 times. I'm going to say while count is less than 4. And then I'm going to add my statements. The first one's supposed to prompt for the average. You could use an integer or you could use a float, whichever one you wanted to use for the project, that's fine. Then we're going to have our if statements that determine what the message should be. I'm going to make a message variable up here just to initialize it so that it's like the empty string. And then I'm going to say if the average is greater than or equal to 90, then I want to set the message equal to, wow, Keep up the great work. Cool. And that's the end of that particular condition. And so now I want to untab to go back out and line up under the I for the next condition. So I'm going to say else if the average is greater than or equal to 80. Then I'm going to set the message equal to a different value. And then that's the end of that else if. So I'm going to go back out to the previous tab stop and say otherwise if the average is greater than 70, then I'm going to make the message say if you put in a little more time. Now I'm going to go back out to the margin and print the last else. The otherwise, that means it's a default else. And in that case, I want to make the message equal, make sure to attend class. Cool. So I think I'm good on syntax for all of those. The last thing I want to do in the loop is print out the selected message. So I'm going to say print message. And then I want to update the value of count, incrementing it by 1 so that we're able to move on to the next student. Let's compile that and run that in Python and see if it works well. Maybe I have typos. The syntax error. I think it's hard to see, but I think that's a O instead of a 0. It's telling me invalid syntax here. Oh, I got an extra parenthesis. One more time, 3rd time's a charm. So it's asking me for my average course grade. If I say I got a 90, it prints the message for 90. If I say 70, it's printing the message for 70. These are good so far. If I print one for 50, prints a good message for that. 80, prints a good message for that. And it stopped after I entered 4 average scores. So that was the solution to part 1 of the lab, where we're reading in an average grade and then printing out a message.